7 in your hymnal. We'll sing the song and be dismissed to our classes. God is so good. God is so good. God is so good. He's so good to me. Jesus is real. Jesus is real. Jesus is real. He's so real to me. He saved my soul. He saved my soul. He saved my soul. And he made me whole. I praise his name. I praise his name. I praise his name. He's so good to me. Got dismissed to classes.
If you would, please be turning your Bibles to Numbers chapter 20. That is where we are. It has been a little bit, but this is a good place to just be able to pick up. So Numbers chapter 20. A lot of really important things happen here. One of those important transitions at least begins. And so some of this probably will be somewhat familiar to you as far as the stories we have in Numbers chapter 20. So just quickly reviewing, we know from the first 10 chapters of Numbers, everything seems to be going pretty well, but they're in one place. God gives his pattern on how they're to be organized, how they're to worship. The tabernacle is central because it's a place where they interact with God's presence in a very powerful way, where the leadership receives directions and instruction. We have a lot of details about the priesthood, which is important. All of this, though, even though it's important right then, it's also important moving forward because it really is preparing them for going to the promised land. And we have a lot of statements there, as we've tried to emphasize in the first 10 chapters, about the fact that they did as God had commanded, that Moses did, that Israel did, that the people did as God had commanded. And so you think, well, this may not be that long of a journey, okay? So things seem to be going pretty well, but then at about chapter 10 and verse 10, there begins to be this shift. And so by the time you get to chapter 11, you begin to see complaining and grumbling and murmuring regarding God's provisions. Now remember, they've been delivered from Egypt. So this journey kind of started going back to Exodus chapter 19. And now it's they've been at Sinai. So even those first 10 chapters, that's where they are. When they actually begin the journey, there begins to be all this complaining and murmuring. And how does the Lord describe their sin of grumbling and complaining and all of that? Unbelief. So we do know in Scripture, both in the Old and New Testament, that the idea of disobedience, even though somebody, they believe in God, but they're disobeying God, can be described as unbelief. Sometimes we think unbelief is just someone who denies that God exists or denies that they believe in the Lord altogether. But these people believe in God. It's just that they are disobeying him. They are distrusting him, and therefore That's described as unbelief. And by the way, even in the New Testament, when these scenes are referenced, if you go back and look at, for instance, especially Hebrews chapters 3 and 4, Hebrews chapters 3 and 4, Paul will speak of it that way. So for instance, unbelief and disobedience are used interchangeably, which would also indicate that faith includes what? Obedience. So a lot of people say, well, I'm saved by faith, but here they're living in rebellion to God. That just doesn't fit with the biblical picture. Okay, so when you look at Numbers, there's two major generations. So what ends up happening to the first, well, first of all, once we get past chapter 10, we've already alluded to it, well, how do things go with the first generation of people? They end up dying in the wilderness because of their unbelief. And of course, we read about that in chapters 13 and 14. You remember the spies are sent. And how many of the spies or scouts, or however you want to say that, are faithful in their reporting? Two. Who are they? Joshua and Caleb. So the majority report, a lot of people are worried about what the majority says. The majority report comes back, and it's interesting because God sent them over to reassure them. You find that out in Deuteronomy. He actually sent them over to reassure them because God knew what was over there. And God had already said, I will be with you. I will bless you. You will be victorious. I'll strengthen you and empower you and all that. So they go over there. And it is interesting, while they all saw the same thing, they didn't interpret it the same way. So, you have Joshua and Caleb, all of this is true, but God sent them over there. He said there's this great fruit and harvest and blessings and houses that have already been built, ready for us. Everything he said was right. And they said that, those who come back that are unfaithful, and the Bible says they gave an unbelieving or evil report. But what else did they say? Well, they said, we can't do it. It's just too much, too big, all that. So God says that's an evil report. He's, as you go through Numbers, there's times where God just wants to wipe them out and start all over again. But he's faithful to his promise to Israel, okay? So as you progress on there, what happens as a result when you get to 13 and 14? Well, he says you're going to die in the wilderness. Okay. Now, who would be accepted from that death in the wilderness? Joshua and Caleb, yeah. So it's interesting, a lot of the times you have a second, like if you look at Judges, the first generation was faithful and then the second generation fell away. And we often make that point. But this is, inverted, like it's reversed. So the first generation is unfaithful. The second generation actually will be faithful to the Lord. They get to go into the promised land. So that's pretty much the background. We've had all kinds of God addressing, all of this unbelief and distrust and all of that. Moses has just been exasperated at times. God has assured him, encouraged him. Moses offers intercession. Aaron tries to offer intercession. And what we've covered here lately, like if you look at from about Korah, you remember Korah? Who was Korah? He was a Levite, but what did Korah want? He wanted power is what he wanted. And they wanted the priesthood. And so he says, what? Being a Levite's not enough because a Levite's a special deal. A Levite's involved in, it's not just I hate to say it, but average Jewish person out here. They're in a position, but they're not involved in what we think of as the priesthood per se. Okay? He wanted more. And so the earth swallows them up, and those who got caught up with Korah, and they're rebelling against Moses, they were complaining about Aaron. You had all of this going on. So when you look at chapter 16, 17, 18, 19, you've got all this death. It's a lot of death. But even when there's death, you have Aaron running out there. Remember we talked about it, and the incense and trying to do all he can and still save quite a few people. Okay, so that's where we are. So when we get to chapter 20, there are three people that are really, really important in this story, in the whole wandering and journeying. So there's Moses, there's Aaron, and there's Miriam. And some things are going to happen in chapter 20. So let's get after it. So to try to set some background here, Just so you'll see the text, Numbers like 20 through 22 is going to recount Israel's third travel narrative. The first travel narrative took the Israelites from Egypt to Sinai, which we were just talking about. You see that coming from Exodus. The second movement was from Sinai to Kadesh. They're moving, and I'll continue as we go through Numbers to try to give you guys maps. If you're not a geography person, that's okay. I just want us to realize what's happening at these places, okay? Because that's important. That's the second one. The third is from, and this will be important, and this is where we are now, from Kadesh to the plains of Moab. Now, I want to mention one more thing. That first generation, when God said, okay, you're going to be punished, after he said, I'm not with you, and Moses said, whatever you do, don't try this, because God's not with you. What does Israel try to do? Yeah, this is so bizarre. So God was with them, and they're cowardly, and when they realize the consequences, he says, hey, don't try to do it because I won't be with you. They say, hey, we're going to try it anyway. He says, if you go over there, you're going to die. And that's exactly what happens. Okay. So the second generation, and we're about to move into that, you're going to see a different picture with them, even though they continue to have some struggles too. So the third, this moving from Kadesh to the plains of Moab, they're getting close to the promised land. I mean, they're not far away. Even when he says, and I'll mention this to you, and I gave you a chart, some of the material from chapter 19. This is what's a little tricky about Numbers. So you read the first 10 chapters of Numbers, and it feels like you're at a snail's pace. You know, you almost feel like it's you're getting every minute by minute. I mean, you're just moving. And then you'll hit a spot, and you like cover 38 years, like, boom, you know. Somebody hit the accelerator. You have to know that time-wise. Okay. So what we'll see today is that some of the people we're dealing with, you're like, boy, Israel sure is slow to learn. Well, you're getting into the second generation. And he'll talk about their brothers who were rebels. He's talking about the first generation. And you'll see that in chapter 20. So, Promised Land. Gordon Wenham, who's got a really good commentary on the book of Numbers, mentions this. He says, certain motifs or models occur in all three travelogues. So up here, as you're reading through, you know, if we start back in Exodus, and then we come through Numbers, and then we get to, and we're at 20 and 21 right now. He says certain motifs occur in all three travelogues. Notice the pattern. So there's a pattern that happens here. He says battles with enemies, complaints about the lack of food and water and its miraculous provision, the need for faith, and the role of Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. I mean, this is just, it's over and over and over. You'll see exactly that going on. So this is interesting, though, when we get later in Numbers, and notice this, these earlier narratives describe, here's how it goes. There'll be these triumphs, and then they're not thankful for God's provision, and then it turns into tragedy, okay? The punishment, judgment. It flips here, though, and we're going to have tragedy at the beginning, but then triumph. So instead of turning triumph into tragedy because of unbelief, what we're going to see in chapter 20, there's going to be some tragedy, and we'll talk about it. But then you're going to see this second generation of Israel have victory. God's going to bless them. They're going to trust him. They're going to obey him, okay? And that's important to see between the two. And there's all, you know, and I described it as a reawakening of the hope of entry into the promised land. So that's very different, isn't it? So with all of this that has happened, now this hope starts to reawaken. Now, I would say the spiritual application for us is this. We can choose to follow in the footsteps of that first generation and take what should be triumph and turn it into tragedy because of our unbelief. Or we can take tragedy and pain and difficulty and loss and turn it into triumph and victory by trusting the Lord. So chapter 20, it's going to feel very familiar. It's going to open up with this record of the congregation of Israel coming into the wilderness of Zin, remaining in Kadesh, and it's going to be here that Miriam dies. So right away, you go, okay, she was a prophetess. Exodus 15 would describe her that way. Who was Miriam? Moses' sister, right. And that would mean Aaron's as well. And so she was significant. What happened previously? I mean, Miriam is a very positive figure generally, but what had happened earlier on in our study of Numbers with Miriam? What? She murmured. Now, that's significant with where we are now. So who really started the murmuring early on in Numbers? Israel, the people. I mean, Moses is just tired. I mean, he's tired. And Aaron is frustrated. I'm sure Miriam at that time was even frustrated. But Miriam gets caught up into this. And she's murmuring and complaining. And Aaron did as well. God judged her. He didn't take her life, but he judged her. Do you remember what he judged her with? Leprosy, yeah. And so because of purification that we've talked a lot about, she had to be separate from Israel. Now, what would that have taught, should have taught Israel when Miriam had to go through that? Anything? Even the leadership is going to be held accountable. Miriam was held accountable. So it's not that, and by the way, if Moses is this terrible person and you know, yeah, he offered intercession for Israel and he begged God for her. It was temporary, but nobody is exempted from accountability to God. And that's important for us. That's true of shepherds and elders and teachers and gospel preachers and parents. That's an important lesson for us to teach. What were you going to say, Roger? Yes, he's going to be. That's right. That's right. Moses will not go into the promised land, and we'll get there. It's a sad part, but we're about to get into why. You're right. Okay, so Numbers 20, you're going to begin to see the passing of the former generation. So we talked about Miriam's sister, how important she was. It served as a reminder of this divine sentence that none of the generation who came out of Egypt would enter Canaan, except for, you know, those who were faithful in their witness. Miriam was a prophet. We see that beautiful section there in Exodus chapter 15 about the delivery and the deliverance. Really a great section. Okay, so let's get into chapter 20. It introduces, the chapter begins with, there was no water for the congregation, and so here comes the complaining, and who's the complaining going to be aimed at, of course? Moses and Aaron, that's right. Let's read chapter 20 and verses, I'll tell you what, let's read verses 1 through 8. Numbers chapter 20, verses 1 through 8. Let's read that together. So, Richard, if you would.
Then the children of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh. And Miriam died there and was buried there. Now there was no water for the congregation, so they gathered together against Moses and Aaron. And the people contended with Moses and spoke, saying, "If only we had died when our brethren died before the Lord. Why have you brought up the assembly of the Lord into the wilderness, that we and our animals should die here? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there any water to drink." So Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the door of the tabernacle of meeting. And they fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the rod, and you and your brother Aaron gather the congregation together, speak to the rod before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock, and give drink to the congregation and their animals."
Okay, let's talk about this. Well, first of all, in Kadesh, there should have been springs of water available, but they've dried up, obviously, here. How significant would this be to survival? Yeah, like everything. If you don't have water, you can't make it. But here they go again, and it sounds very familiar to us. Why did you bring us to this wretched place? Now, the promise has been to the promised land, but it's like it doesn't feel like we're going to get there, okay? And we're going to die out here in the wilderness. And so you have this whole kind of major life-threatening problem coming up again. Now, there's another case. Can you think of another case that feels very familiar to this? If you can read my slide. Exodus chapter 17. So let's turn back to Exodus chapter 17. This sometimes it gets kind of confusing this whole rock incident, and there's several good things about what Moses and Aaron do here. One of them is this situation, they're complaining. What do Moses and Aaron stay, get in a fight with them and start? No, they don't do that. They go back to talk to the Lord, to get his counsel. So that was a good move. This has happened, but it feels like it's happened before. So let's look at Exodus chapter 17, and let's read verses 1 through 7. It says, Then all the congregation of the sons of Israel journeyed by stages from the wilderness of Sin according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, Give us water that we may drink. And Moses said to them, Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? Now on this occasion, and let me mention to you, these are not it's not exactly the same event, and the text makes that very clear. So some people say, look at all the similarities. That's true, but there's just as many dissimilarities. Okay? There's several differences. One of them is, in this case, Moses does engage them. And notice, and he gives the Lord credit, but he says, when they say, give us water that we may drink, Moses says to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? So you're quarreling with me is really testing Yahweh. Verse 3, but the people thirsted there for water, and they grumbled against Moses. And they said, why now have you brought us from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, what shall I do to this people? A little more, and they will stone me. Then the Lord said to Moses, pass before the people and take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand your staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall, and this is important, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. He named the place Massah and Meribah because of the quarrel of the sons of Israel, and because they tested the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? And there's several really important things to take note of. So I will tell you that this term Meribah, sometimes it's referring to this event in Exodus 17 and Massah certainly. But there are times where you read about Meribah Kadesh, and that's this event in Numbers. Okay, they're so similar, sometimes they sound alike. But there are clearly some differences that we're going to take note of. So the details matter, what God says matters, and it matters even for Moses. So in the case when we go back to Numbers 20, we're going to contrast these a little bit because they will be important and there's a lesson to learn here. So in the first case, did Moses obey God in Exodus chapter 17? Yeah, he did. He did what God said. He gave God credit and gave God glory. Even when he says you're quarreling with me, but you're testing the Lord. Okay. So when you come back to Numbers 20, in this case, and maybe there's building frustration, but in this case, if you look at chapter 20 and verse 6, rather than continuing with the complaining people, Moses and Aaron just leave. They just leave and say, look, we've got to go talk to the Lord about this. So we're not going to sit here and go back and forth. And you have to realize by this time, Moses and Aaron have been through it. I mean, Moses has been through it with them before. He's seen this disposition because Moses is in here with both generations. So he knows what's going on. So when we come back to Numbers chapter 20, if you'll notice in verse 6, then Moses and Aaron came in from the presence of the assembly to the doorway of the tent of meeting And what did they do? They fell on their faces. They're humbly seeking counsel from God. There's another point of application there for us. That when we are struggling, even when we're frustrated, before we act, we need to go seek the Lord's counsel and prayer. What were you going to say, Conley?
What, in the timeline of Numbers 20, what year is this roughly, would you say? Like near the end of the 40 years of wandering?
I gave you that, and I can't pull it up right now, but Emily, do y'all have that? You know, it has the little...
It said first month, 40th year.
Yeah, so that gives you...
And the Exodus 17 is like near the beginning of
Yeah. So because you're Exodus 17, that's taking you back. I mean, they're wandering and all. You have Exodus 19, Sinai, so that takes you back. But I think you're talking about another generation, is really what. But it's like they're walking in their father's footsteps here. They're saying the same kind of thing. So when you look at this, they seek God's counsel. We see this phrase a lot. When they go back to the temple, or the tabernacle rather, the glory of the Lord appeared to them. That's a representative of God's presence, and God's will and wishes and word and purpose are going to be expressed. Ashley, a good commentator on Numbers, argues that the other time the phrase is used, now this is kind of interesting. There's another time this phrase is used, the glory of the Lord appeared to them, and it is in chapter 14 and verse 10 at Kadesh, when they began their wandering, and now they're kind of at the end of the wandering, and you get that phrase again. So that's just an interesting thing to take note of. Now I've mentioned, hey, there's similarities, there's also differences. Let me mention some of those to you, because there's some who are modernists who try to argue that somebody's like cutting and pasting this is the same. No, these are different. Notice with me, first of all, in Exodus 17, only Moses is an actor here, whereas in Numbers 20, it's Moses and Aaron. So it's a little bit different. Number two, the people here refers to the deaths of the rebels as their brothers. See, okay, now I want y'all to stay with me on this. When they talk about, he talks to them about how that there were the deaths of the rebels and they were their brothers. I think that's the previous generation. And now he's talking to this generation. And he says, hey, you're doing the same thing. The people of Korah's day in chapter 16. Third, the rod that Moses is commanded to take is probably Aaron's rod, which in chapter 17 was put before God. And fourth, the methodology that Moses is commanded to follow. And this is the big one that I want you to see. Okay? When you look at Exodus 17 and when you look at Numbers 20, they're not the same. Because God tells him to do something differently this time. Right? So, do details matter? Yeah. God wants us to listen to him because that's the only way we can really have a relationship. We're going to notice more. In Exodus 17:6, what did Moses do? He struck the rock. What did God tell him to do? Strike the rock. Okay? So he did what he should have done. In Numbers 28, what did God tell him to do? Speak to the rock. What did he do? Struck it. And there's more in the context. So this isn't the only reason God was displeased with Moses, but from reading the text, I believe it matters. I mean, it's a major issue. Yeah, go ahead, Mike. Sure, I don't know if I can answer it, but I'll do my best.
In verse 10, it looks as though Moses may have, and I don't know if it's just me reading this into it, where Moses elevated himself
Yes.
to the same level as God.
That's going to be important. That is a good question, and I think we have the answer. Hang on. But you're right, because there's more to this context. I mean, the striking versus speaking matters. I'm not minimizing that. But sometimes we read that and we go, oh, I kind of feel sorry for Moses. There's more going on here. And we all feel sympathy because we can all think of times when we didn't listen well and maybe elevated ourselves. But Mike's question brings up an important point, and we're going to hold off there because I'm going to be back there in just a minute. Go ahead.
Well, and follow up on that, I guess we're into it. I think that sometimes that's the only thing that we focus on. We focus on, well, he struggled with all
Yeah.
that. He is struggling. But there's a whole lot more to it.
That's right. And I think this other's going to explain why he wasn't listening like he needed to. You're right, Tony. So we'll be back there in just a minute. Okay, so I made the point. You got multi-generational stuff going on. The grumbling and complaining has been a recurring cycle of unbelieving behavior. We've seen that before. Moses is probably thinking, we really didn't bring you up from Egypt to leave you in this terrible place. We brought you up from Egypt for the promised land, but because of the unbelief that we've had to deal with, we haven't gotten there as quickly as God really wanted and had in mind. So it's interesting. I'll get you in just a minute, Terry. It's interesting that people tend to blame God when they don't obey God, and there's consequences of that, and things don't seem to be going as was anticipated. And now it's God's fault, when in this case, it's not God's fault. This would have been a short trip. It would have taken a little while. But the first generation would have been going into the promised land if they'd just done what God said. They didn't, and now they're blaming God that they've been out in the wilderness for so long, when really it was Israel's fault they had been out in the wilderness for so long. And he held them accountable for that. Taryn, what were you going to say? That's right.
Typically give a generation about.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's 2 generations almost back,
Mm-hmm.
if I was 10, brought up out of 50, now I'm almost 50. The only way I really know about what he was what my parents, what elders.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So either they have consistently held talked 40 days
Mm-hmm.
about Egypt
Yes.
so prominently that now the younger people that are now mid and older believe that's so strong, or there's still some old people sitting around going, 40.
Yeah, okay, so let's talk through that. I don't know if everybody heard Terry. So if you've got 2 generations, and his point is, let's say you were 10 years old, and you heard your parents talking about how Egypt was so much better than this present situation and complaining about the leadership all the time and all of that. Either, you've just listened to that and that continues to be the experience and you're replaying that, right? And that influence. And therefore, that parents can instill in their children a tendency to complain, to rebel, to distrust. So there is that. And then there's also just the strong tendency that we have, in addition, going with that, to complain when things don't immediately happen in a way that would be more comfortable for us. To go along with that, though, this is an application point for us. God had memorials and worship and the priesthood and all kinds of things. They're telling this story about what's in front of them. If you've got what's in front of you, you've got your present situation. There's 2 ways to look at that. There's what's in front of you, and then you can look back, okay? So looking back, remember we talked about how they've reframed and restructured the story of Egypt. That the fact was Egypt was a place of slavery and abuse and death for them, but they talked about how great it was because they had a diverse diet and all this foolishness. But there's looking back. So here my parents are saying looking back, Moses and Aaron and the priesthood, and remember we even studied when all that death happens the censers and then being melted down and being at the, he did all kinds of things to say, let's keep looking forward. But the way the first generation generally is framing it is not according to reality. It's not spiritually beneficial. It's not grounded in faith. It's not looking forward to the promised land if we obey. Okay? So you have, instead of their parents, their family, and their worship harmonizing and therefore helping this younger generation come along as they should, there's this tension between here's what spiritual leadership is saying, this is what worship is saying, this is what God is saying, but my family is saying something else. And so they're going to have to make that decision. So what we don't want in our families is to be out of step with what God says and what the Word says, and really the message of God being the center of our life and our worship. And that's what they're struggling with. Now that second generation is going to come on. But even here, you see this grumbling and complaining. It's a major issue. And there's a lot of reasons that might be. And I think that's a worthwhile point. Okay, going back to chapter 20 and verse 6, Moses and Aaron seek the Lord. He tells them what he wants them to do. So the Lord commands Moses to take the rod, which apparently had been placed before the Lord in chapter 17. That, by the way, that rod was supposed to demonstrate godly leadership and God's deliverance and God's blessing. So he tells Moses, now let's look at this. He tells Moses and Aaron to speak to the rock, in contrast to chapter 17, where he tells Moses to strike the rock. All right. Earlier in Numbers, we've seen Israel's disobedience against God, describes their refusal to believe. We talked about all of this. Let's move on. So Moses took the staff in his hand, and he and Aaron gathered the people before the rock. We'll come back to this, but the rock in the Old Testament, the rock here is actually, in a sense, going to foreshadow Christ to come. And we'll see how that is in just a minute. So I want you to go back. Somebody turn back to Numbers 16, 28 through 30. And I want you to see how what Moses says there. Let's come back to Numbers 16. Numbers 16, let's read verses 28 through 30. And I want you to catch the tone of this and what it expresses. Numbers 16, 28 through 30. Alan, can you read that for me? Numbers 16, 28 through 30. You got it?
28 through 30.
Yeah, Numbers 16, 28 through 30.
Moses said, hereby ye shall know that the Lord hath sent me to do all these works, for I have not done them my own mind. If these men die the common death of all men, or if they be visited after the visitation of all men, then the Lord hath not sent me. But if the Lord make a new thing, the earth open her mouth, swallow them up, and all that pertain unto them, and they go down quick into the pit, then you shall understand that these men have provoked the Lord. And it came to pass, as he had made an end of speaking all these words, that the ground clave thunder that was under them, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed them up, their houses, and all the men that appertained unto Korah, and all their goods.
Good, that's good. Notice how he said that. The Lord has sent me, but this is the Lord's doing. So it was clear, and Moses often would do that. He was doing the opposite. Now remember, Israel has wanted to take glory to herself. Israel has wanted to say, we want our way. And they complained about the Lord's provisions. Moses is the one interceding for them before God, but also complaining to God about this people murmuring and rebelling and distrusting and all of that. Okay. But when we get frustrated, frustration can mount up and intensify to such a point that we don't respond the way we really want to respond. We've all experienced that before. And maybe we're frustrated with people who are doing the wrong thing. That's what's going on here with Israel. But notice this section here, Numbers, let's go back to Numbers 20. And look in Numbers 20, verse 9. So Moses took the rod from before the Lord, just as he had commanded him, and Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the Lord, and he said to them, listen now. Now notice, what does Moses say they are? Listen now, you what? Rebels. Shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock? Must we? God says, speak to the rock. He struck it. Just imagine, I can almost hear anger as he strikes the rock and says, must we bring forth water? Must we provide this for you again? Okay. That's not what Moses sounds like before. It's not even what Exodus 17 sounds like. It's not what Numbers chapter 16 sounds like. And that goes back, I think, to what Tony was saying and what Mike was saying. The context of this. So, what is Moses failing to do here? Give God the glory. Tony, what were you going to say? Right.
There's a lot of dynamics because the people keep, I guess, if you will, now Moses is here. I don't think deliberately looked like he wanted to take it. But he's not giving credit to God.
Right.
But there's something else I think God is merciful. He's a just God, but he's merciful. Although Moses struck the rock and didn't give him credit, he still provided water.
That's right. That's
He
right.
had struck Moses dead, or he could not provide water at all.
That's right.
He was still merciful for the people.
Yeah, and he doesn't remove Moses from this. It's not like he killed Moses on the scene or just wiped Israel out. He doesn't do that. He loves Moses. We know, and remember what it says. Generally, Moses is described as the most humble man on the earth at the time, which I think there's several important lessons, and that is we need to realize that even people that are very humble and very faithful and serve God the best they can have bad moments. So you could probably take anybody and say, well, I know about this one moment, and you can take that moment and decide that, I'm never going to listen to that person again. Well, what if you took this one moment and said, we're never going to listen to Moses again? So there's that. I mean, really good, faithful people make mistakes and have to ask God for forgiveness, okay? And we all need to know that about ourselves and about others. Secondly, I think it is interesting, as Tony mentioned, he does go ahead and look, the people aren't in a good category here either. In fact, I want you to look at something. Let's look at Psalms 100. I believe it's Psalms 106. Turn to Psalms 106. And even the Holy Spirit describes what really had led Moses to this. Now, he's still going to be held accountable. Now, he's not going to lose his soul over this, but he's not, and it's going to be a sad, and when we get there at the end of Numbers, you'll see it, but it's sad to me that he is able to look over into the promised land, but Moses won't be able to go into the promised land after all of this because of his actions. But Psalms 106, let me see, yes. Look at verse 32. They also provoked him to wrath at the waters of Meribah, so that it went hard with Moses on their account, because they were rebellious against his spirit. Now, some say they're rebellious against the Spirit of God in him. I think probably the Old King James and other translations, I think they're rebellious against his spirit, like they're rebellious against Moses. And notice it says, he spoke, look at verse 33. How did he speak according to verse 33? Rashly. Now that's not like deliberate rebelliousness, but it is rebellious. So he spoke rashly. They were rebellious against him and against the Lord. Thus he spoke rashly with his lips. They did not destroy the peoples as the Lord commanded them, etc. And he goes on to talk about other issues. But my point to you is that when you look at this, there's several things. When he says we, and you know, I remember when I first started, I'll say this quickly, when I first started preaching, my dad telling me this, and he would always quote this reference that, you know, as shepherds, as gospel preachers, we want to preach strongly, but we don't want to nobody needs to fall into the trap of thinking somehow we're going to elevate ourselves and it becomes must we bring forth water. God is the one that brings forth the water. We'll come back there week after next. Thank you.